Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Person You Want to Be. I am your host, Eric Teplitz. Today, I am truly delighted to have with me as my guest on the podcast, Scott Freiman. Scott Freiman is a composer for television and film, a serial entrepreneur, and a professional Beatleologist. He is the creator of Deconstructing the Music, a series of multimedia presentations that initially spanned the Beatles' entire catalog of recordings and is now branching out to include the music of other artists. His lectures take fans on a fascinating, comprehensive journey into the creative process, leaving them with a deeper understanding and appreciation for how their favorite music was actually made. He has presented his lectures to sold-out audiences at theaters nationwide and has spoken at colleges, universities, and corporations, including Pixar, Google, and Facebook. His six-part series, Deconstructing the Beatles, premiered on Maryland Public Television in February 2024 and will be airing on PBS stations nationwide in early 2025. His first non-Beatles deconstruction on Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon album made its premiere in August of 2024. Scott Freiman, welcome to The Person You Want to Be.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to speak with you today. I have been a big fan since I saw you in person for the very first time, which would have been in early 2016 at the Crest Theater in Westwood. Sadly, now extinct. I believe it was a
Yes,
COVID
yes.
casualty, but you did 2 nights back to back there, and I was so blown away by the first lecture you did, which was on deconstructing the early Beatles, that there was no way I was going to miss the next night. And I told everyone I knew, I was like, "You've got to see this guy." And I consider myself a pretty rabid fan, Beatles fan, and I was really struck by how much stuff you presented that was new to me or that I hadn't seen or heard. The extent to which you do your research is really, like, all the hard work you put into it really comes together for a pretty magical experience. So I just want to salute you on that.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's very, very kind of you.
Yes, and I'm going to resist the temptation to just talk nonstop Beatles with you today, because I want to dive deeply into your story and hear about the twists and turns that brought you to where you are today and what you're doing currently. You could think of this as deconstructing Scott Freiman.
Okay.
All right. So I'd like to begin at the beginning and just ask this very broad question to you, which is to have you think back on your earliest memories, maybe the earliest inkling that you had as a youngster of what it was you really wanted to do, what you wanted to be, what you were here for, what you were drawn to, however fanciful, because as kids, our imagination, the sky's the limit, right? Does anything come to
Right,
mind?
right. Well, when I was little, just to tell you what my parents were like, I told everyone I was going to be a king doctor. And when people said, well, what is that? That is a doctor that tells all the other doctors what to do. So I've, a lot of my life has been twists and turns that have not been planned. They've been accidents. I've taken a lot of risks, and some have panned out, some haven't. Most of them have. And looking back, there is a common thread, which is that I love to teach. I love to share things with people. I'm one of those people who, when I see something, I want to call up a friend and say, "Hey, did you see this?" And that has filtered into my career as a CEO of software companies, being in sales, educating employees, managing teams, and of course, in everything I do with the Beatles and Floyd and whoever else, talking about music and sharing what I've learned. The research is great, great fun. But when I get to share it with people and have comments like yours, where I can tell you something you didn't already know or put it in a different light, that's always been very interesting to me. And I can kind of see that all the way back to, wanting to be the king doctor, the doctor that told the other doctors what to do.
I love it. did that tendency manifest in any specific ways you remember as a kid in terms of, sharing things that you loved or presenting things in any format?
I loved performing. I was a pianist from age 4, and any chance I could play at a party,
Hmm.
that was great. I'm a lot shyer now as a player, but I like to share. If that's kind of a very general
Right.
statement, but that idea of sharing something I enjoy with other people, I think that's been somewhat of a common thread.
Got it. And where did you grow up and what was your childhood environment like?
So I grew up outside of Baltimore in a town called Pikesville, and I had very good high school buddies. We're still very, very close together. It was a town that the kids were educated. My parents, were big supporters of education, of course. And it was I had a little bit of a small town feel. Everyone kind of knew what everyone else was doing. And Baltimore at that time, you really didn't go down to the city very much. So we stayed in our area and we went to the bars and restaurants and movie theaters in our town. And I hadn't really experienced life outside of that to any large extent until I went to college.
Got it. I want to home in on this. You started piano at age 4. So, um,
Yes.
was that in the form of formal lessons?
It started out with my aunt. My grandmother had an upright piano, and my I would go over to visit my aunt, who was only 11 years older than me, would teach me Mary Had a Little Lamb and Frere Jacques and whatever. And my parents wisely, and I'm quite grateful for this, said, let's get him lessons. Well, teaching a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, it's kind of hard to find a teacher who can do that.
Hmm.
And we found this wonderful woman who would teach me, she would put me on telephone books on a bench, and she would teach me that the treble clef was the upstairs and the bass clef was the downstairs. And when there was a dot on a note, it meant it was very hot. You had to take your finger off quickly for a staccato note. And that's how I learned. And then a few years later, she was in a car accident, had to cut back her students. And she recommended me to her teacher, who turned out to be a world famous pianist named Ronaldo Reyes. And I studied with him all through high school and even a little bit afterwards, but it was all classical piano. I had no real experience with rock and roll or pop music other than, my parents liked Broadway and they liked, Frank Sinatra and they liked Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Band. And so it wasn't until about age 11 or 12 where my uncle uh, took me aside and said, okay, enough of this classical crap. We got to get you into the Beatles, and introduced me to the Beatles.
Yeah. Life changing for you. I think,
Absolutely.
I mean, almost everyone I know, I think, has had some kind of introduction to the Beatles that ended up being life-changing. And, in some regard, I mean, their impact is incalculable. And the amount
Yeah,
of
yeah.
the amount of joy that they have brought to the world and continue, like it just keeps reverberating through the generations. It's I mean, what more is there to say? But
Right.
but again, thanks to your uncle. Uncle, let's give him some props.
Uncle Alan, yes. Well,
Yeah.
and what's really interesting is my entrance was by the artwork. So
Mm.
he showed me the albums and he told me, this means this is marijuana. I didn't know what marijuana was. This means Paul might be dead. And this album is all white and see how it's different than this. And it was like, wow, this is so cool. And so even before I heard a note of music, I was already into what's going on these album covers. And uh, and it was great because I got into the music right away. And then, of course, I went to the piano and tried to start figuring out some of the music by ear. And I would do my classical piano practicing, and then I would play Beatles songs.
Nice. And it's interesting so that you entered their musical world via the visual, the album cover, which is something of a lost art. And it's not lost on me that I know you have a background as a film composer, and that's all about writing to the visuals, creating
That's right.
atmosphere based on the visual. Um, what was your introduction to film and film music as a kid? What do you remember about that?
So once again, it's one of these things that I cannot pinpoint a specific moment. Always interested in film and always enjoyed film. And it wasn't really until later in life that I started to recognize the importance of the music in the film. So I didn't collect movie scores and things like that. I mean, I knew, the theme to Jaws and things like that, but didn't really study it until I got older and actually went back to grad school and started to dive into some of the great film scores and understand that many of them are memorable, but many of them are just to serve the picture. And the hardest thing for people who become film composers or TV composers is to realize that your music is not the most important thing. The visual and the story is what you have to support. And if people remember your music, that's great, but it's almost bad if they remember the music and they don't remember
If it
the
stands out too
film.
much, yeah.
So that's right. That's right. Yeah. Um, so yes, I mean it's really interesting. I found that I wish I had had more time to do that because it's something very enjoyable and it's something that I think you have to really really work at. I know people who are professionals in that world, and they spent decades really honing their craft and figuring out systems to work quickly and to come up with scores and deal with all of the constant rejection where a director says, I like that, but can you take out the flutes? There are no flutes. Well, whatever that thing is, just get rid of it, and having to deal with that back and forth. And it takes a lot of it takes a strong spine, and it takes a lot of work to do this. But it can be very very rewarding.
Yeah. So you were playing piano as a kid, and it sounds like it was a strength socially, playing for friends and whatnot at parties and all of that. When you were in high school, how seriously were you? You mentioned you still were taking lessons, studying with this pretty serious teacher. Um, Two questions about high school. Number one, did you envision yourself continuing seriously with the piano? And or did you have any other notions as a high schooler, projecting into adulthood what you were interested in or what you thought you might be doing?
Yeah. Well, the school guidance counselor never said I could be a Beatleologist. That wasn't on the list of things I could do. So the music to me, I knew I wanted to do something with music, but I had been sort of brainwashed is too strong a word, but I'd kind of sort of said that I was going to be a doctor. I just was that was what I was going to be. And when I told my parents I wanted to major in music after high school, because I played with the choir, I was playing with various groups. I wrote a musical in high school, so I was clearly definitely very very into music. But they suggested strongly that I needed to look at another major. So my original thought after high school, I loved math. Math and music are very connected.
Mhm.
I would major in math and music, and then and be pre-med, and that's how I started my college career with that in mind. But music certainly was for me something that brought uh, uh, that helped my social life quite a bit in school. I wasn't a sports guy. I wasn't, I don't know. I was basically the music guy. And so if there was a party and, by that point I'm playing popular music and there's a piano there, hey, have Scott play something on the piano. And, people in school, I was known as, the music guy.
Yeah. Did you play in bands or pretty much just solo?
Yeah, pretty much solo. I didn't play in a lot of bands. I accompanied the school choir,
Mhm.
and occasionally, for talent shows and things, I would accompany singers. But no, I was never in a band until now. I mean, until much much later. Which again, it's one of my regrets. It's just something I didn't. There weren't a lot of other musicians to form a band with, and I didn't know a lot about it. And maybe if someone had asked me, but it wasn't something that was on my radar at the time.
Mhm. I've heard it said that the music that you are, listening to and maybe obsessed with right around the age of 14-ish or so is imprinted in a deep, deep way, like on a cellular level, kind of for life. Obviously, we can be introduced to music that we end up loving at any age, but there's something about those like teenage years where the hormones
Yes.
are all over the place, and biochemically we're just like uh, exploding chemistry sets, and something about, I think, the highs and lows of that period of time bring gives us kind of an extra sensitivity, I think, to experiences and memories, and certainly something as powerful as music. What kind of music at that age, let's say high school-ish, were you, most interested in, and had,
Yes. Definitely Elton John and Billy Joel, pianists. And so, that I gravitated definitely towards them. Um, and the Beatles, of course. I think that I was into the later Pink Floyd, a little bit of David Bowie, sort of the classic rock artists of the 70s. That was my introduction. Queen, I was a big Queen fan, and uh, the Police, bands like that. And a lot of the music I like today, as you said, I have a huge array of bands that I really, really like, but it's like comfort food going back to some of those albums that I listened to when I was a teenager.
yeah. Got it. So you went to Yale for your undergrad, and
I did.
as you said, now you ended up majoring in computer science, correct?
I
And music,
did. That's
not
right.
math and
Yes.
music,
I took my first math class and there wasn't a number to be found anywhere. And I said, this is not for me. I don't know if you remember on the Carol Burnett show, there was Tim Conway played this character called Mr. Huygens, and he would walk like, very, very slowly and talk very slowly. That was my instructor.
Hmm.
And he was completely indecipherable, and he wrote the textbook. And after that, I said, no more math. And I love math. It's really such a shame. So, but I gotten into computers in high school. Back then, again, this was just before the TRS-80 Radio Shack came out, and certainly before the Apple II.
Hmm.
And my school had a very early little computer. When I took my first, the only programming class, you filled out punch cards, and then they were sent to a local university, and you got them back a week later with the errors that you had made. So, but I was always interested in that. And again, there is definitely connection between math and music and programming and so forth. And so after math, I took a software course, and I really, really enjoyed that. So I said, okay, that is what I will do. Um, and then my parents sent me a book on the first year at Harvard Med School, thinking that it would be a nice thing to, you know, inspire me. And every
A
page, I
book
think I
about the
was
Harvard
breaking out in
about
about yeah, it's
yeah.
someone's experience. I think I want to say it was called Gentle Vengeance. That might not be the right title. It's something like that, and it's about a guy's first year at Harvard Med School. And I was like breaking out in hives as I was reading it, saying, there's no way I want to do this. And so it was now computer science and music, and that was where I was headed. And what I was going to do with it was a big question mark.
Yeah, how much clearly, like, your parents had a soft agenda for you to to advance on to medical school. What was that like negotiating? How disappointed were they that you didn't, kind of take to that path? And where, as when you're at college age, life can be pretty confusing. I mean, you're expected to make kind of big, presumably lifelong decisions that how can anyone be expected with the life experience that you don't have
Right.
to even know who you are, let alone what the world's going to be like, and
That's right.
especially now. So I'm just like interested to know at that time of your life where your mind was, and how even if how important was it to you to have that kind of thing figured out, or were you just
So
kind of playing it by ear?
I was playing it by ear very much. I mean, I think that there was definitely part of me that was, nervous, like any student who's approaching the end of college and thinking, what am I going to do with my life? And I didn't have clear answers. And I think my parents were always extremely supportive. But from their generation, uh, the idea, well, music is, there's no career in music, and computer science. What does that really mean in the 80s? I'm not sure if they. I'm sure they knew there were jobs for computer people, software people, or whatever, but maybe didn't have that as refined. But happy that I was graduating with a degree and with some skills other than just music that potentially would lead me somewhere. For me, I didn't really have a clear idea. I knew my friends at Yale who were musicians were going on to be rehearsal pianists on Broadway, and I didn't want to do that. Or they were performers, and I was not that great a pianist, and I certainly didn't want a career as a classical pianist or something like that. And what was interesting is this is right when synthesizers and software synthesizers were really starting to become a big thing. And had someone taken me aside and said, you got computer science, you got music, you should be applying to, Avid or what Digital Design at the time, or one of these companies that's doing music software. Uh, I could have very easily gone down that path, but I didn't even know that was available. So the music was something that I thought, well, I'm just going to put that on the side for now, and I'm going to follow the computer path and see where it leads.
Just out of curiosity, to backtrack a little bit, the piano teacher you were studying with for a significant number of years, did
Yes.
did he push you in any like one way or another? Did he have any expectations of you or for you?
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, I was entering contests and I was getting, honorable mentions, and he had students who went on to become, names, and I was clearly not at that level. So I don't think he had any special vision for me, and I didn't. He wasn't like a mentor to me as he might have been to some uh, better players, if you will. So I was going for my piano lessons. I was, going to whatever contests I was being shuttled to, but there wasn't any kind of plan that he was saying, hey, if you do X, Y, and Z, this is how you lead to a career. Or maybe you should look at conducting or things of that sort. So I didn't really get any mentorship from him. He was just a piano teacher, a very good one, but just a piano teacher.
Got it. It's really interesting because negotiating life and navigating and our way through and making these like potentially like big life decisions. I don't think it's easy for anyone, but if the right mentor shows up, they can hold a vision for you that you might, like you said, not have it might not have even occurred to you, or you might not yet have a sufficient self-belief. But that's the role that a mentor can potentially play, is kind of to hold a vision or to kind of suggest a possibility and believe in you for you on your behalf, and maybe
Yes.
give you a push or a nudge. But often, and maybe more often than not, we don't have that experience.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
we're left to kind of figure things out on our own. Or, as you said, had someone pointed out to you this niche of, synthesizers that was exploding, perhaps if you had been steered. And this is what's so interesting. I mean, just in terms of, when I think of the Beatles story, right? I mean, it's hard to pick what is my favorite of your lectures, but the one that you do on basically the birth of the Beatles, how the Beatles came to be, just might be
Hmm.
the most interesting,
Hmm.
because you home in on all of these little things that so easily could have gone so many other ways, and
Yes.
all of the tumblers that had to kind of, you know, fall into place, all the things that had to line up, the specific events and people they had to meet at the exact right time. And the timing is just, you can never orchestrate that.
Yeah.
And it kind of, because again, because the Beatles, we think of them in hindsight as, well, most people agree at this point that they were just geniuses, brilliant artists. And it's hard to imagine a world without them, unless, of course, you're the
Mhm.
filmmakers of that movie yesterday. But uh, but we tend to believe in hindsight that things that they would have one way or another, that because they were so good, they would have had to have,
Right.
uh, break out into our consciousness. But what do you think? Do you
Well,
believe?
so well, so people have this vision of them just sort of springing to life, and all of a sudden there's Beatlemania. And as you point out, their story is full of these moments where if one person hadn't gone into the cafe at that moment, there wouldn't be a Beatles. Or if this guy was, picked as the drummer, but he wasn't available, then we pick this one. All of those things. And if there's anything I've learned from the Beatles story, is this fascination I have with exactly that, the going through my life
Mhm.
and thinking of those moments where if I had just not gone to dinner at that time, I wouldn't have run into this person, and this wouldn't have happened, this would have happened. And you know, I have some of that to share with you, but that is definitely so true of the Beatles. And you think what magic there was that all the stars were aligned that got them together. And would there have been a Beatles if Pete Best had turned out to be a better drummer, or if John Lennon had given up and Paul McCartney went on to form a band with someone else? There are all these things that could have happened, but the way this happened and the way they worked together and gelled and created this wonderful body of work is truly extraordinary, and it is definitely inspirational. And it also says, I think to a large extent they didn't have things planned either. They didn't know that there was going to be a life in rock and roll. I mean, they would joke that they're going to be, to the toppermost of the poppermost and so forth, but they were kids. They didn't know how to get there. They didn't know what could possibly happen to get them there. Bigger than Elvis? How is that even possible, right? So it's fascinating. It really is.
Yeah, I'm endlessly intrigued by, and this sort of question of how much, fate plays a role. And I recently rewatched the film version of your Deconstructing the Birth of the Beatles, I can't remember the name, if that's the name of it. And I was really struck this go round by how much tragedy there was ancillary to the Beatles. All of the people in their circle where things didn't work out so well.
That's right.
I mean, Pete Best perhaps being the most well known, and of course, who's to say his life didn't work out so well, and who's to say, be careful what you wish for, and we never
Right.
know whether getting what we think we want is ultimately in our best interest or not. We can't know that. We think we do, but we're usually wrong. um, but there is like a profound amount of tragedy surrounding the Beatles, and of course, even involving the Beatles themselves. John Lennon's early demise. Um, Comes to mind. So this notion of fate, destiny, chance, luck, hard work, uh, will, determination, and how these things like collide, and what really creates those tipping points in our lives. That's part of what I like to get into, and why I like having these conversations on the show, because
Mhm.
these are unanswerable questions ultimately. But I think with each interview, you get kind of another kind of like glimpse at these questions. And I'm always interested
Yep.
as well in what guests have to say. Because looking back, it's easy to, that's famous Steve Jobs quote about you can't connect the dots unless you're looking backwards, or something along those
Right.
lines.
Yes. Yeah.
But does that
M-
mean that it was fated to be, or does that just
Right.
mean we're making sense of what happened?
Right. Well, my grandfather, who I love dearly, who was a business owner here, he ran a whole series of grocery stores and liquor stores in Maryland, was very successful. And I used to sit around, Saturday nights when we would have dinner with my grandparents, and he would talk with my father about business, and I wasn't interested at all. But later, all that stuff sort of filtered in, right? I remembered all those conversations. But he used to say, at one point, I said to him, I feel like I'm very lucky and he said, there are everyone is presented with opportunities. Some you don't even realize are opportunities, but not everyone goes after them. And he said, that's the difference with you, Scott, is that you go after them. And the way I interpret that is like, not everyone is stupid enough to do things that may not bring you any kind of money, or it seems like this is a complete waste of time. And those are the things that have made me what I am today,
Mm.
is pursuing things that many people would have said, I'm not going to waste my time with this, you know. So I've lots of stories of that, and it really hits home that we do, especially in the 20s or so, when you're growing as a person, you're really becoming a full adult. There are things that happen, perhaps, that you say, I'm not going to do this, or I'm going to say no to that dinner or that meeting, or what have you, and I tended to say yes to everything. I still do.
Mm.
And 9 out of 10 times it was maybe not a waste of time, but it doesn't lead to anything. But that one time,
And
makes you,
you never
you
know, when that's
never
going to
know.
be. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
So, so you're fresh out of college, and I know that
Yes.
you eventually form a company, Credit Management
Yes.
Solutions Inc. But what happened between your graduation and that?
Right. So when I was backing up a tiny bit, when I was a freshman in college, that summer, I ended up working at a store called The Logical Choice, which was one of the very first computer stores. It was before, Apple stores or anything. And they sold the brand new Apple II computer. And I was working
Can you
there.
give us a year there? What year that was?
So 1985.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, 1981. 1981.
Mm.
So it's the summer of 1981, and I'm working in this computer store selling Apple II computers.
Oh,
There were
this is
like
before you're out of college.
before I'm out of college.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm in college, right? There are like three software programs. There's something called VisiCalc, which was a spreadsheet, and there was a WordPerfect, and there was one game or so, and then we sold $10,000 Apple II computers and printers, and that was it. And a gentleman walked into the store, and I was there with another salesperson, and he was out to lunch, so I waited on this guy, and he was talking about something which I didn't know a lot about: car leasing, automobile leasing. Turned out that automobile leasing in the early 80s was a fairly new concept on the East Coast, and it really started on the West Coast, and now was coming to the East Coast. And the problem was there was nothing to do the calculations to figure out car leases. And this guy, Jim, was in that business. He was signing up car dealers, and he thought, he'd read about computers, and he thought maybe they can help me in doing the calculations, so that when someone calls and says, I've got a 24-month car, $15,000, what is the lease payment going to be? Because there were no calculators in dealerships to do this. So he came to me, he explained this, and I said, well, there's VisiCalc. It's this spreadsheet. You can put in two numbers and they'll add together and so forth. No, I don't really know how to do that. What else? Well, there wasn't a lot else. So I said, well, the great thing about Apple computers is they come with this language called BASIC. And so you can actually find someone to write a program for you to do exactly what you want. Um, and Jim said, well, could you do that? And I said, well, I'm just a college student, but someone like me, I could do it. And he goes, tell you what, I'll buy the computer and the printer and the disk drive and all of this, and hire you to do the software for me. Now, granted, I'd been with him maybe 20, 30 minutes max.
Wow.
So I said, hold on one second. And I went into the back room and talked to the owner. And I said, there's this crazy guy out here who wants to buy all of this stuff. He wants to hire me to be a programmer. What do I do? The guy said, Are you nuts? Tell him yes.
It's the
So
logical choice.
it's a logical choice. So that is how I met Jim DeFrancesco, and my probably most important mentor in my life. And so
Wow.
while I was in college, I wrote software for him. We then developed another product which got a patent, and that sort of lasted through college. So I was running, sort of doing programming on the side while I was supposedly studying and doing musicals at college. After college, I went to work for Bell Labs for a year, and I got there, and they said, "We've lost our funding, so here's your office, here's your computer. We'll figure it out." And for the time being, just play with the computer. And a year later, they still hadn't gotten their funding, so I left. I said, "You're paying me, but I'm not doing anything." And I moved back to Baltimore with the idea of becoming a musician, and I went to work for Jim. And now, if I were smart, I wouldn't have moved to Baltimore to get into a band, but that's what I knew. I moved into sort of the slums of Baltimore, and Jim hired me to do some programming for him. And that programming, and the short version of the story is that ended up becoming the basis of a company which became CMSI, Credit Management Solutions. Basically, he was acting as a credit approval on behalf of some banks. So he was an intermediary between the car dealers and the banks. And I wrote the software to contact the bureaus and analyze them and help him make those decisions. And prospective banks were coming in to visit with Jim that he wanted to sign up as banking customers, and they were more interested in the software that Jim's
Ah,
company was using. And so Jim said, knowing nothing about software, let's form a software company. And he's 15 years older than me. He's been running businesses since he was out of high school. I know nothing about business, and he asked me to be his partner.
hmm.
And no reason in the world to have done that. He could have said, "Why don't you be my chief developer or anything?" I mean, what did I know? And he brought me in as a partner, and we formed this company, and it went on from there.
Fascinating. And just out of curiosity, were you gigging at night because you said you moved back to Baltimore with the idea of playing music?
Yes. So I had auditioned for some bands. I ended up producing a band of ex inmates from one of the prisons. I mean, crazy stuff. But once the software started to take off, that became my full time thing, and the music was gone. I mean, other than playing for fun, I
Hmm.
wasn't doing anything professionally with it.
Got it. And you eventually were made CEO of the company, is that right?
Yes, yeah. So we went through a bunch of changes. The company went public, and after we went public, we brought in another CEO that Jim had left. Another CEO come in. We didn't like him, and so got rid of him. And Jim
He
once
he was the
again,
Pete Best of
he
credit
was the Pete
management
Best.
solutions.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Oh, the stories I could tell. But in any case, so Jim had left to bring this guy in who was supposedly a real CEO. And now that we were a public company, he thought that it was time to bring in this guy. And it turned out this guy was not very good. And so when he left, um, Jim said to me, "You've got to be CEO." And again, I said, "I'm not sure I can. I mean, you've taught me a lot, but that's a pretty big responsibility." And he said, "You can, Scott. You can do it." And so I then became CEO, and then we sold the company 3 years or so, a few years after I took over, maybe 2 years. Sold the company, and that's when music came back into my life.
Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, I didn't know this story, but it sounds like Jim really was that hypothetical mentor I was talking about who held this vision of, no, you could do this. And he believed in you and he um essentially groomed you. I mean, in a certain sense, or he saw your skill set and valued it and, you know, compensated for whatever doubts you had by reassuring you, no, you're the guy. And It really sounds like a pretty fortuitous um,
Yes.
encounter in a
Yeah.
store while you were working. I mean, that's life,
Exactly.
right?
Well, that's the thing. It's like if I had gone to lunch at that moment or not been there, my day off, I wouldn't have met Jim. My whole life would have been different. But I mean, we're still very close. But he came from a completely different background, very, very different than mine. He never went to college. He went into the Air Force. He was a pilot. Um, and his business training had been, starting as a used car salesman, basically. That's how he learned about business. And here I am, this music guy who knows software, but went to Yale and partnering with a guy who with a very very different background who values me and is willing to fill in the gaps of the things I didn't know, which were substantial. And it turned out to be just a great, great partnership. His temperament is very different than mine, um, but we made a great, great team.
Hmm.
And so, even he was an investor in my second company, and I could always call him for advice and to get his thoughts and get his opinions. And he always, valued mine. So it was really wonderful to meet someone like that in life, and he had, profound effect on everything I did afterwards.
Got it. Um, a tangential question, because again, I don't know you personally, but I'm always interested and curious about how people meet their significant others. So,
Uh-huh.
uh, at what point um, did this happen for you?
Right. So I met my extraordinary wife, Allison, in 1980, 89, July of 89. Um, I had a very close friend from college who went to grad school with Allison. Allison was moving to Washington, D.C., where I was. And my friend Laurie gave her a list of people to contact. And I was top of the list. And so Allison called me up and said, "Hi, I'm Laurie's friend." And I said, "Mm-hmm." And she said, "Laurie didn't tell you I was calling, did you?" I was going to call. And I said, "No, but what are you doing tonight?" And we went out on a date. And that's it. So,
Hmm.
but she's another one who hard to call your wife a mentor, but but very inspiring because she has an amazing business background, amazing marketing background. She's also a speaker and a writer and so forth. And so it's someone who I can talk to about life and business and issues I'm having, and vice versa. So it ends up being a very good partnership.
That's fantastic. And I don't think there's anything at all inappropriate about thinking of your spouse as a mentor. It's one of the roles that they can play. And, in any good partnership, you're bouncing ideas off of each other and providing perspective for each other. And you come from different, you're not the same person. So you have some different
Right.
vantage points, right? And sounds like she had a lot of really helpful and useful um, skills and insights that, were very, very like a natural help, which I mean, we need all the help we can get in this life. So I think that's fantastic,
Exactly,
really cool. And
exactly.
where were you in your life trajectory when you first met her, when you met Allison?
So it was just before my company went public. We were actually, the company was not doing that great at the time. So she was there all the way through, our rise and sale and so forth. That's where I met her. And she formed her own company as well at this, not long after we got married, was a nonprofit. And then, uh, yeah, so we were, about a 6 months or so before I sold the company. We knew there were discussions, there were people approaching us. It seemed imminent. It seemed like something was going to happen. And we were out to dinner. We were on vacation. We were out to dinner, and my wife said, "So when you sell the company, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, you know what I'm going to do. I want to do music." And she said, "Well, you're not going to sit in the basement playing with your keyboards." And I said, "Okay, I'm not." And she said, "No, no, well, you got to do something." And I said, "Well, I really want to try my hand at film composing." She said, "Okay, well." California or New York, and I'm not moving to California. And I said, okay, how about New York? And literally over 5 minutes at dinner, we had made the decision we just finished moving a house, fixing up a house. We had kids who were all in school, and we had loads of friends in Baltimore, D.C. And we just made the decision to pick up and move. And
Hmm.
once the company sold, that's what we did.
Did you live in Manhattan? Is that where you?
We lived outside of Manhattan, where we live now in Westchester County,
Hmm.
and we bought a house. I built a music studio,
Hmm.
and
Second
I
Act
started going to
Studio?
second act studio. That's right, and I started going to grad school, getting a degree in music composition.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot going on. I mean, you're raising
I
a.
told you that a lot. It's been a little bit crazy.
Yeah,
Yes,
well, I mean, but it all sounds great. I mean, but you're raising a family, and she's taking a big, like step professionally, and making a bold move and starting her own company, and giving you like her blessing to do what you want. I mean, not everyone is in a position, even just like practically or financially to be able to do that, especially if they're raising kids, right? So it
right.
sounds wonderful. Like it sounds pretty great. So you went back for your master's at NYU, right? Studying music
Yes.
composition, and also simultaneously starting to run Second Act Studio.
Yes, so I was learning, I was trying to get into film composing.
Right.
I was uh, trying to figure out what it means to run a studio. I didn't have an engineering background or producing background, so I was taking, courses and classes on engineering, and I was bringing people into the studio, opera singers, heavy metal bands, string quartets, whomever, and bringing them in and recording them and engineering them, sometimes playing on the recordings, and that was a blast. And on the side, while I was doing some producing, I was also doing some composing. I was writing songs. I was teaching a class at the elementary school, and I produced a Broadway show.
Hmm.
Anything that had something to do with music, I was pursuing because um, I wasn't sure which path I was going to go, and I enjoyed it all. And it was probably not a smart decision on the one hand, because if I really wanted to focus on, let's say, film composing, I should have focused on that. Or if I wanted to focus on being a producer, I should have focused on that. But I was trying to do everything and having a good time, but realizing that,
Well, it's a common
at some
question. Become a specialist or a generalist, right?
exactly, exactly. Even in film composing, I was advised, I would put together a reel of music, and there would be, orchestral thing, and then there would be electronic thing. And I was advised, you got to concentrate and figure out, are you the electronics guy, or are you the classical simulation guy, or whatever. And I didn't want to be one person. I wanted to do everything. But that's actually a little bit of a disadvantage, because when people hire you for a film or to score something, they kind of want to know your style. I didn't have a style. I wasn't good enough, or didn't have enough time to develop my style. My style was all over the place. You want me to do a country western thing? I'll do a country western thing. And so it made it definitely. I think that was a disadvantage for me, um, but I was busy doing lots of things, so
Yeah.
it was fine.
How did you find your clients, your studio clients?
So word of mouth, a lot of word of mouth. Another one of these quirky things that happened is I met another friend, mentor, partner, Al Catabiani, who's the guitarist and my partner in Culture Sonar, which distributes all my videos. And I met him because I taught a class of fourth graders songwriting,
Hmm.
and I decided, because I like to do everything big, I decided for the final thing, we should put on a concert, and I should bring
School
in
of Rock.
a band. Exactly. School. This was before School of Rock. So I was trying to find people in this town I'd moved into who were musicians, and I got, I got to Al in a couple different ways, and he was part of my band, and he had a record label that he had just started. He asked me to help him with that, and Uh, Through that, I met a lot of local musicians. And then, one of the members, actually, two of the members of the Tokyo String Quartet were in town, and they needed a rehearsal space. They needed to record some rehearsals. So they contacted me. John Patitucci, who's just one of the top bass players in the world, uh, lived in the next town. And he got hired to do a recording and needed a studio, and someone told him about me. So it's just sort of this random thing. Um, it was marketing didn't really seem to do much. It was mostly all word of mouth.
Hmm.
And because I was outside the city, um, I wasn't getting a lot of clients coming from Manhattan, so it was not ideal. And that's not to skip ahead, but that's how the Beatles thing got started.
Right. But at the same time, location, 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 right? So if you had been in Baltimore, like trying to make this work, no,
No,
you wouldn't have had these opportunities and like connections nearby. Even though you were outside the city, you still were in the New York area, and for people who lived outside of the city as well, you were available, you were there. And that also strikes me in a lot of people's stories is the importance of, you can't foresee, you can't predict, and you can't orchestrate life, but
right.
you can do things that are going to increase your chances for opportunities. And if you go to where the opportunities are likely to be based on your interests, your industry, what have you, where the people are, the movers and shakers, or just, that makes a huge difference as well, I
Yeah,
think.
yes, yes. Well, that's also, back to film composing. One of the other big suggestions was you've got to move to California. All the people that I had met in New York who were trying to become film composers were all moving to California. And that was certainly a possibility. And I had the same, my son is a video editor. I had the same talk with him as like, if you move to California, I have contacts there. I know other people have contacts there. There's work out there. He's plenty busy in New York. Um, so I think nowadays maybe more and more people are remote, but back in the early 2000s, it was hard to become a film composer doing big movies as opposed to little indie things if you weren't in California, because that's where most of the creative people were. Those were the people who were networking with each other. Those were the people who were making these movies, and I think that's changed a little bit, especially after the pandemic. But yeah, location. If I'd moved to California again, my path would have been different.
Yeah, it's a good point, the remote work thing and the changing world, because technically speaking, you can do work, a lot of jobs from anywhere, but there's still that piece of making the connections and the in-person, like the trust and rapport that's built by meeting with people in person. I mean, this is a hot topic in the work world these days.
Yeah,
Um,
well, and it's a real issue. I know a lot of not only my kids, but all my friends' kids who are in jobs where they're largely remotes. And so much of what we all learned about life and about our careers and everything, and finding mentors and so forth, you can't do that over Zoom, and not as effectively. And there is something to be said for, going out to lunch with your peers as opposed to running to the kitchen, grabbing something out of the fridge, then going back and sitting in front of the computer. So I
and chance
worry that
encounters.
that's right, exactly right. All those company meetings that were completely unplanned, but it happened to be I went to get a cup of coffee. Someone else came in. I said, "What are you working on?" "Oh, I have an idea, and let's go to the whiteboard." And that stuff goes away when you're remote. And the technology that's available now to collaborate online is phenomenal. Personally, and maybe just where I come from, I don't think it replaces being in person.
Yeah. Yeah. So before we pivot into deconstructing the Beatles, and I want to hear all about that. I just want to uh, learn a little bit more about the music composing that you did for film and TV, how you found the jobs, and
Mhm.
maybe some of the standout work that projects you worked on.
Wow. I have to think back. Again, it was mostly word of mouth. When I was at NYU, I would post in the Tisch School for anyone who needed a composer. So I met some people that way. I met a director who I scored a short form for her, and she hired me for another short film. And then a friend's son was making a film and knew I was a composer and put me in touch with him, and I did that. So it was lots of word of mouth. I didn't have a lot of marketing advertising. I mean, I had a website, I printed business cards, I went to a lot of events and networked, but most of what I got, if I recall, was word of mouth.
Yeah. Was there serious consideration of moving out to California for that or not?
No, no, there wasn't. I mean, I think my wife is from New York, and I love New York,
Hmm.
and we we had kids. We didn't want to pick them all up and move. I've lived in California. It's just I love visiting. I love being there, but I don't think either one of us were ready to move and
Hmm.
leave family and friends
Yeah.
and go to the West Coast at that time. If things had gone on a different path, and if the film stuff had taken off, or if I really felt I wanted to dive into that, then maybe I would have sat down with Allison and said, I really let's move for a couple of years and let's get this working. And then once I establish myself, we can move back to New York and something like that. It didn't go that way.
Right. Now, the origin story of deconstructing the Beatles. I've heard you give kind of very quick explanations of this, but I'd really like to focus in on this and zoom in and sort of ask everything you remember about that very first initial presentation that you gave. I'd like to know the circumstances. I'd like to know the venue. I'd like to know who was there, and just how the whole thing came about.
Yep, yep. So this I know very vividly, and I have the pictures to prove it. So I remember well. Um, so I belong to this group called the Manhattan Producers Alliance, and it was started by some composer producer people in New York, and it was basically a networking group. And we met and had speakers. I taught a composing class with some of the members, and it was just sort of a social group, but for professional musicians. And I've met some really good friends through it. But it was in Manhattan, and here I am with this professional studio. The guy who designed my studio is John Storick, who designed Electric Ladyland,
Oh,
among
wow.
many other studios. Yeah, amazing guy. There's a movie about him just out now about Electric Ladyland. But I hired him to do my studio, not knowing who he was. Shows how naive I was. And so I had this great studio in my house, but 20 miles from Manhattan is like, you might as well be in
Hmm.
Wyoming or something. And I had all of these producer composer friends in the city, and I wanted them to see the studio. And I could show them pictures, but I kind of wanted to get them out. And I also, felt like I wanted to do something for the group. I wanted to find an opportunity to do an event or something. And I had just gotten a hold of something that was circulating in the ether at that time. This was probably 2009-ish, I want to say, around 2009 or so. Um, there had been a leak of a few Sergeant Pepper 4 tracks. So isolated tracks from Sergeant Pepper, from Day in the Life, with a little help from your friends, and there was one other perhaps. And I thought they were so cool uh, because I was a Beatles fan. I used to read the Beatles recording sessions of the Mark Lewison
Hmm.
book, and here I was now able to listen to the individual tracks and hear the components. But well, this is really cool. Maybe I can do something around this, and that will become an event. And maybe I can get some people to come up to Westchester for that and see my studio. So I put together a presentation on the making of Sergeant Pepper and spent weeks. These are those things I do that who knows why I'm spending this much time doing it, but I did because I was having a blast. I did a lot of research. I found other stuff online. I put together a keynote presentation, and I invited people out, and I had 30, 40 people in my living room. I had my TV screen up and my grand piano there. I
Hmm.
dressed in a Sergeant Pepper costume, and I started to give this talk. And I was 10, 15 minutes into the talk, and someone said, when are you doing this again? There's some other people who have to hear this. And someone else said, would you come? I have a college class, and would you come and teach a class? And someone else said, there's a theater out on Long Island. They would love this.
Hmm.
And so after this night, and it was like 3, 4 hours long. I mean, it was just, I didn't know. I just put together this whole thing. I had no idea how long it was going to be. People were asking questions. People were into it. We took breaks and had food and drink and came back for more. And when it was all over, the next day, I started to follow up on some of these things. I taught a class. I went out to Long Island, and again, without any real thought of what is this going to lead to, but I had a great time doing it. It'd be fun to do it again. And I put all this work into it. So there was a theater out in Long Island in Huntington called Cinema Arts Theater. And I was put in touch with the head of the theater there. And I said, I have this thing. It's not a movie. It's not a lecture. It's sort of a combination thing. And he said, sure. Maybe we'll set you up in our cafeteria and we'll try it out. So I came out to Long Island. They had a big screen in their cafeteria. Why they didn't you put me in a theater, I don't know, but they put me in the cafeteria with speakers, and the thing was sold out. And there were people, the back of the cafeteria had a glass window, and there were people outside staring in like this. And I was blown away. Like, I thought, like, this is really cool to me, and maybe my producer and composer friends would be into it, but would other people be interested in this? I had no idea. So after that talk, I got referred to other theaters, and then people started saying, well, when are you going to do the White Album? It's like, oh, I have to do another one of these. So it just took off. And then
Hmm.
I did that for a while, and people seemed to enjoy it. And then someone approached me from a company called Abramarama, the head of the company, and said, you should turn these into films. And I said, I think that would be amazing, but there's no way I can do that because I use all this Beatles music. And he said,
Hmm.
well, I've seen your shows, and I think that there's fair use that would cover a lot of this.
Scott, I want
And
to interrupt you. Just pause you for a second.
sure,
Two questions. First of all, tell us what exactly is Abramarama, the company,
okay.
and explain for those who might not know why it's such a big deal, huge issue to use Beatles music in a movie. And if you have any idea of the actual cost, I'd be interested to know that as well.
um, so Abramarama is a distribution company. They are the largest, certainly one of the largest distributors of music docs. So many of the music documentaries that you see that are out in the world, you'll see at the beginning when they show the credits,
Hmm.
Abramarama. And they happen to be located near here, near where I live. And Richard Abramowitz, who is the head, is a great guy, and a sort of a legend in that space. And so his thought was, we'll help you turn these into films, and Abramarama will be the distributor, and we'll form a partnership and divide the millions of dollars we're all going to earn from this. So that's who Abramarama was. And the second question, Beatles music. So when you use music in any kind of visual media like a film, you have to pay. You have to obtain the rights to do it, and then you have to pay for the recording, and you have to pay the publishers. And in the Beatles case, first of all, to get permission to use the music almost always requires Ringo, Paul, Olivia Harrison and Yoko Ono to make a decision. And then the cost of that, there are I've heard um, Tomorrow Never Knows was used in Mad Men a few years back, and apparently it was a couple $100,000. So it's a lot of money. And my shows, as you know, are wall to wall music. I mean, use a lot of music, but I also use a lot of rare tracks that haven't been released. And so the ownership of those and how you compensate for that and so forth, it's a little tricky. So there is this type of law. What's the word I want? There's something called fair use, which dictates how you can use any kind of media um, without paying for it under very specific restrictions.
Mm.
Okay. And as an example, if you are doing a documentary and you are talking about a song and you play a certain amount of that song, but you're playing the song to illustrate your point, in general, that's allowed. If you're playing it as background, if that's entertainment, that's not allowed. So having to create a lecture and a film that uses music and photos and videos, but only to illustrate what is being talked about and not a second more,
Hmm.
that's a challenge. And in fact, when we filmed the first four films live, one take all the way through, and I had met with the attorneys ahead of time to make sure this was all going to be kosher. We'd actually even talked with the president of Apple just to make sure that they weren't going to sue us, because they can sue no matter what. And they said, as long as you've got the legal clearance, and they knew our counsel, we're not going to bother Paul and Ringo and so forth. It's fine. So we filmed all of these one take, and then sent the edits to the lawyers, expecting the rubber stamp, and got back 10 pages of notes. And now we had a problem because we filmed this live, and they were saying, well, you need to cut this piece
Hmm.
and you can't show that photo and things like that. So we had a fun time editing that. And since then, I've gotten much, much better at figuring out what exactly is fair use and what's allowed. And it's all just changed recently. Again, there's been some new case law that has changed it. So it's a very, very complicated topic. And it doesn't protect you 100% from lawsuits. Even if you think it's
Hmm.
all fair use, someone can still sue. So it's tricky. But anyway, I don't remember where this all started,
Yeah.
but they were turned into films, and luckily we were able to get all the legal clearances we needed.
Yeah, it's impressive. And I imagine, is there out of curiosity, when you play a musical clip, even if it's a rare um, demo or even like an isolated track, is there a time restriction? Like you can only play so much of the song?
Yeah, it's not time. It's in fact, some of my movies, I'll play a track for a minute, um, but there has to be a
A
reason
justification.
a justification. If I say, here is Paul's bass line, take a listen to this. Now listen to George's guitar, and I'm showing enough of that to show George's guitar, that's allowed. If it goes on too long, they may say you need to cut that. And it's tricky when you're playing, 8 bars of music and they say you can only play 5. Well, you can't just cut randomly. So you have to figure out how to make it
Mm.
work. But there are other times where you say, John Lennon sung on this track, and okay, you can play 10 seconds of it, and that's it because John's singing. Okay, we got it. So it's a little trick, and
Yeah,
I'm not a
we don't need
lawyer.
to get into the
I'm really
weeds, but
generalizing, but that's the general idea. Is it's about how does what you're playing or showing uh, support what you're talking about, and no more than that,
got
because
it.
then it becomes entertainment.
But the live versions of your lectures are going to be longer than the films.
The live versions, I could take a little more leeway. I mean, technically, even live, you're supposed to be careful. So I'm still not playing full tracks and
Right.
things, but you're much less likely to be sued because of a live one-time show than you are for something that is permanent media that people can
Sure.
stream and watch on DVD.
Yeah. And one of the things I really want to point out about what I admire about your presentations is, I really want to know about this. The pacing of them is superb. And what I
Mm,
mean is that, you've got in any one of these presentations, you're dealing with a ton of material. And we're talking about, you know, audio clips, photos, stories, sometimes video clips, graphics, but there's just a ton of content. And I don't know how much, like, how you, if you have a list of cues, I don't know how you operate when you deliver these things. Obviously, with practice, you start, I'm sure, like, honing it, but keeping the pacing going to keep people on the edge of their seats throughout the duration of the presentation. Now, of course, I'm your ideal audience, but I know even people who are not quite as diehard fans as I really find your presentations compelling, and
mm.
like, and as I've viewed them multiple times, that's really something. And I don't know how much of it is deliberate or how much of it is just kind of a happy, like maybe some of these restrictions help in that regard. uh, but I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about how you
Well,
approach the
that but
pacing.
I really, really appreciate that. Uh, for me, these presentations are all about story.
Yes.
I try and have a story. I try and not just say, listen to this, listen to this. Okay, now here's another track, listen to this. I try and have some kind of story. For Rubber Soul, it's they've got 30 days to make an album. How are they going to do it? And the race against the clock. For Abbey Road, it's like the tension in the studio. For Birth of the Beatles, it's how are these people ever going to come together and form the band? What is the sort of overarching story? And then when I practice the lecture, and sometimes when I deliver it live, I can feel, there's some yawning in the audience. Okay, this is slowing down a little bit here. I need to cut something or pick it up. So some of it is um, innate, I guess. I have
Intuitive.
a sense, I think, intuitive, right, of that I'm feeling like where things are moving along, where they're not. Sometimes, though, it's feedback from the audience, and I'll say, "Oh, I need to really cut this out." But like the Pink Floyd show that I'm doing now, my goal was every slide, I want an aha moment.
Hmm.
I want people, to say, wow, I didn't know that. Wow, I didn't know that. Wow, I didn't know that. But at the same time, it's not just aha for the
Random.
sake of aha.
Yeah.
It's making you appreciate the music and it's part of the story. And when I do that, when I'm successful, I think it's really fun. And I think the audience, as you say, really appreciates it. When I don't do it as well, that's when the audience is like, well, you know, after an hour, I kind of got tired, and I try that happen.
Yeah.
But
Any performer can, learns from audience feedback and repetition. And yeah, I was just interested in, like, do these things typically go through iterations, or is it, just through the practice and doing the show and honing it, like, by maybe, small degrees or increments over time? How do these things typically, come to life for you?
so, so what I've done historically since that very first talk in my living room is I introduce my new lectures for friends and family and other musicians in my living room.
Nice.
And so, to use my most recent example, I invited people over in early August and I gave my Pink Floyd lecture. And again, it's friends and people are talking in between and we're chatting. And so it's long, but the admission, the cost of admission is you got to give me feedback.
Mm.
And some of it is our mistakes. Like, thank goodness I caught, someone caught that for me. Some of it is, well, I love this part, but this part to me, I thought you could explain better or whatever. And because I'm catering to people who are musicians, producers, college students, people who know the band, people who don't know the band,
Right.
young people, old people, uh, how to find that middle ground where you keep everyone's interest and you don't get too into music theory, but there's a little bit of music theory there for the people who are interested in that. And you don't get too into what type of guitars are playing and what effects they're using, but a little bit of that for people who are interested. And the feedback that I get from that initial living room show is
Mm.
often um, if I have someone say, I want to see a little more of this, and someone say, I want to see a little more of that, I kind of know I have the right balance, if you know what I mean.
Yep.
Um, but that's how I do it. And then doing the show live, in Pink Floyd case, I've changed almost nothing.
Wow.
After the living room, I made some corrections, but after that, it's been playing well. But other shows, I change all the time, and of course, new information comes out. I decide that I want to add a new track or take away something. So they could continually evolve.
They are living thing, like they are kind of
They are,
continuously
yes,
evolving. Yeah.
yes,
The
yeah.
other thing I want to mention for those who haven't experienced your lectures, and it's something else that I deeply appreciate about them, is this balance that you strike. And you give such a 360-degree picture of all of the elements that were involved. And I had Robert Greenberg on this podcast. I don't know if you guys know each other or if how familiar you are with him and his work, but he kind of does what you do with classical music. So there aren't so many photos and video clips,
Right,
but he
right.
basically gives and they're rich, they're really like often technical and dense in theory, but he gives so much context. He's this huge believer in how important understanding the history and the context of the material is, how it's absolutely essential and it gives such deep, you get such deeper insights knowing these things. And that's something you do as well in your lectures, because you take into account what was in the air, what was like the zeitgeist, what was popular on the radio, what were the cultural events of the time, what was going on historically, what was the technology, what were the developments, the latest developments in technology and restrictions in technology, what who were the Beatles interacting with, what inputs were they taking in, and all of the different elements. So if you're like not so much of a techie, the whole thing isn't that. There'll be some of that if you are. And if you're not, so you don't care so much about the theory, well, maybe this would interest you. But if it doesn't, you're quickly on to some other angle. And I think that
hmm
that
hmm
really helps as well. But even still, like I said, I really admire, especially viewing more than once, viewing these multiple times, just observing how the pace, for me anyway, I mean, speaking, for
Well, that
myself, is
again,
like
great to hear. Yeah.
yeah, for me, I'm always left wanting more. And I think that's the highest
hmm
compliment. That's if you're going to err on one side or the other, that's the side to err on, right?
Right.
Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
but yeah,
Um,
so it sounds to me like, it sounds like you did this lecture as an offhand thing. You wanted to make a contribution to this group you were a part of, and you were still like you were sort of a generalist in that you owned and operated a studio. When necessary, you would contribute to recordings with producing, arranging, or playing. You as opportunities came up to do talks or appearances even at schools, you did those. You were when composition gigs came up, you did those, and it was a sort of a generalist approach. But
yeah.
this landed in a big way, and I think it's a big argument for at least initially trying lots of things and following what you do love, because what you do love, maybe only you and one or two other people love it, but maybe not. And the feedback that you get from the world and from life and from people can help guide you toward or away from a particular route that you're taking. You can't force things. Boy, have I learned this the hard way. You really just can't
Yeah.
force something that you want to work to work.
You have to be, my opinion, you have to be kind of attuned to what the world is telling you. If the in this case, I had no expectation, and the world
Hmm.
told me, the world,
Yeah.
people told me this is of interest. You need to do more of this, And sometimes we get very focused on something, and we're people. It's not getting a response, whether it's a new product or whatever. Um, in this case, this is a perfect example of something which I didn't do it with the intent of I'm going to do this lecture and this is going to become a thing. I did it for some friends in my living room, and it just took off from there. And I listened to what I was being told, which is like, hey, there's a lot of interest here, and you should do more of this. So there you go.
Yeah. I want to respect your time, but I do have a few more questions.
Go ahead.
So, number one, as you keep accumulating additional lectures and presentations, that's a lot to keep alive and in your memory banks, at least enough to deliver
Right.
these effectively. So, how do you juggle that along with the creation of new ones?
Right. Well, I can't remember anything about like what I had for breakfast or my kids' names or anything. I only remember Beatles facts. But no, it's when it's like when I learn pieces on the piano. If you practice them enough, they become part of your memory. I played just a complete aside. I played a gig with my band last week, and we hadn't rehearsed in a long, long time, and we ended up playing a song that all of us had forgotten. And someone said, oh, well, let's skip it. And I said, no, let's do it. Let's do it. And we tried it. And as we were playing it, we hadn't played it in like 2, 3 years. We all remembered the parts. My fingers were doing things I didn't even know what they were doing. And that's how the lectures are. Like once I get the opening and I have the slides, so I have something, I have a crutch, if you will,
Mhm.
to sort of prompt me along the way. It's not so hard to relearn a lecture, to do one I haven't done for a while. And then new material, it's going to be interesting. I'm trying to balance some TV opportunities now, with also seeing, if I want to do Pet Sounds or Ziggy
Mhm.
Stardust or Night at the Opera or whatever, is there going to be an audience for it? And is there some other format other than trying to get theaters to fill seats that I can do these things and make some money at it, and do it in the way that I like to do it, which is entertaining and a good story and all of that. Put in all that time and energy into the research and development of a presentation. What is it for? And as theaters are having more and more trouble filling seats, I have to think about, the further I get away from the Beatles, the harder it is to attract an audience.
Hmm.
So there are many of these lectures I would love to do, but maybe they're not in a theatrical format. Maybe they're not films. Maybe they're just, on demand uh, seminars. I don't know yet. So I have to figure that out as well. And then I have a lot of ideas about ways of turning these into uh, a series, a TV series or films that don't rely so much on the music, and but still talk about this era and of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and 90s, and music and artists who develop and what their inspiration is and what the technology is and what's going on around them, all of that, but maybe in a different format. So it's just sort of germinating out there right now. I'm not sure. And then the other thing is I'm focusing more on corporate and conference engagements and keynotes. There's a lot we can learn about creativity,
Oh, yeah.
collaboration,
Hmm.
teamwork. All of this from looking at people like the Beatles. I mean, you can learn a lot from that. And when I talk at some place like a Pixar, and people come up to me afterwards and go, when you talked about Strawberry Fields Forever, you were describing how we made, Finding Nemo. I
Wow.
mean, going down one road and then saying, no, let's throw that out and go another way and so forth. And I think there is an audience that can can enjoy a talk about music that has some application in their work in advertising or in software development or in business in general. And so I'd like to pursue more of that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also, I have to at least touch on this because I understand that it was through maybe one of your early presentations that you gave that an opportunity came your way to start another company. Can you talk a little
Yes.
bit about that?
Yeah. So early on, I was still trying. The Beatles lectures were still to get me into the world of film and television composing. I mean, I still had that in mind. And so I volunteered to give a Valentine's Day lecture in California for a group called Yale in Hollywood, basically
Mm.
just what it says, Yaleys who are working in Hollywood. And I thought, I'd go out, I'd do a lecture, get a whole bunch of people in the room and network, and they'd all hire me to do their films. And one guy showed up with his wife.
Seriously?
And
Like
yeah,
that
yeah,
was your
yeah.
audience?
That was my audience. And the room they had for me was a bar where they had a TV screen that was about, you know, this a little tiny
Mm.
LCD screen and two little speakers. And I'm out in California. I'm not going to sulk about it. I'm going to do a good presentation. So I gave a presentation to this guy, and he friended me on Facebook. And a couple weeks later, he said, "I have a friend who was approached by these composers who want to start a software company. Would you talk with them?" And long story short, I ended up agreeing to co-found the company and become CEO because this guy saw me at a Beatles lecture.
Right.
So, and that's another one of those examples where you say, well, why the hell am I doing a lecture for one person? But it might just be the right one
Wow.
person. You just
That's
never know.
wow. Yeah, that's a powerful example. And the company was called is still in existence, right? Qwire?
It still exists. It's called Qwire. I just resigned as CEO the end of August, actually. So I ran it for 12 years. Our clients are people like NBC, Universal, and it basically helps with the clearing and licensing of music. So all the music for the Olympics, every time you hear music that's played on the television, whether it's a background segment or someone as part of their act, all of that music has to be licensed to show it on television. And managing all of that is a logistical nightmare because
Mm.
every song has multiple people attached to it. You have to pay for it. You have to make sure you have the right rights and it's thousands and thousands of calls and letters and things. And we built software that essentially puts it all in the cloud and helps people manage it. And so that's what we built. So I learned a lot about music licensing from running that company and reporting and royalties and things called Q sheets, which are how writers and publishers get their royalties. So that was great. And but now I'm focusing 100% on TV production and music education. And I think there's still a lot for me to do in that area. I don't know what, but
That's a
that's
very
where I'm going to be
exciting,
focused.
very exciting. I applaud you on your bravery, but also like this thing is works. How many years have you been giving these lectures before you made this leap to decide, all right, this I'm going to make this now my full-time thing?
Well, so I think the first living room lecture was 2009. So it's
Yeah, so
been,
15
a good
years.
15 years. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I've gone through, almost every year I've developed a new talk.
Hmm.
As you mentioned, this is the first non-Beatles talk, the Pink Floyd talk. So about every year there's been a new talk. And in between, I've taught an online class, the Fab Four Master Class. I've led trips to Liverpool and London.
Hmm.
I've taught at Yale. I taught a semester course there. So there's been a lot of ancillary things while I've been developing the lectures. So now, really, I don't know what's going to happen. I have this public television show, and I know that they would like to have a season two, so that will be fun to do.
Hmm.
And is there opportunity to do more there, or what have you? Time will tell.
Right. Thank you, Scott, so much for making the time for this conversation today. I think it really was illuminating, certainly for me, and hopefully for lots of listeners. Just whether they're interested in the Beatles or just the circuitous paths of life and figuring out your place in it. I think that you had a lot of valuable insights for us, and I'm wondering like what advice you give your own. You have three sons, right? Your own kids,
Yes.
and or for people coming of age now, and especially in this ever increasingly rapidly changing world, which is kind of frightening. What do you have any words of wisdom to share about, finding your way?
Yeah. Get away from the computer and meet people. Um, meet people, socialize, and network. Because as I think I've shown, you never know where opportunities are going to come from. And I have people who contact me now who I haven't talked to in 20 years, and they found me on LinkedIn and something has come up and they thought of me, or they saw something I did and they wanted to connect with me. You just never know. And so having good friends and good family, but also getting out and meeting people, I think is really, really key. And that's how you find your fun adventures.
Yeah, it's a good way to look at it. What about AI? How much of a threat do you think this is for people in the music industry specifically, and young people looking for careers more generally?
Well, I think that's a whole nother 3 hour
Yeah.
conversation because
Yeah, right.
that's another area that I mean, my concentration in college was actually AI, believe it or not.
Wow.
Way back, yeah, and back in the days where it was, still very, very conceptual. Um, so I have a lot of opinions on that. I think that there are a lot of things that AI can do that are rote tasks that it can be extremely helpful with. Some of the things Apple announced yesterday are really, really cool. The ability to find a photo just by describing it, and schedule things on your calendar by talking in plain English. Things like that are time savers and they're great. AI can make music now. We've all heard it. It can do pretty amazing things. Does it replace a composer or a songwriter? I don't think so. Not for quite a long time. I think there's human experience that AI doesn't have, and it doesn't understand. It just understands data, and so it doesn't understand being in love or breaking up with a
Mm.
girlfriend, or what it means to be in a war or whatever. It just knows, quote unquote, knows from analyzing data. And so writing songs with any kind of emotion, writing a film score that really reflects the film. Um, you can definitely do a lot, and there are a lot of opportunities for AI. But I think the biggest opportunity for AI is in helping to automate a lot of things which are time consuming, and allowing people the time to do the things that are more creative.
Hmm.
And that's where I think we should focus. I think AI is probably not going to come out with the next great idea. But if you tell it how to find, if you give it information to find a drug and it can analyze huge sets of data, it may be able to do that more efficiently than a human can. So I think there's a lot that remains to be seen, but I think music isn't going away, certainly, and human generated music is certainly not going away,
Yeah, and
not for a
human
long, long time.
also like live human beings together in a room
That's right.
playing and or listening and
Well,
experiencing.
yes. And that's a really good point. That's a really good point, is that so much of music is about the experience of the music. And you need to have, even if you're using electronics, you want to have people there, and you want to be experiencing it with other people. And I don't think AI replaces that.
Yeah. Final question before I send you off, and that is just what I ask all of my guests, which is at this juncture. I mean, you're at definitely like a crossroads and an inflection point. It sounds like in your career. Who is the person you, Scott Freiman, envision yourself being or want to be? Or you mentioned, some of the projects that you have on the horizon, but it could be professionally, personally, or otherwise. Who is the person you want to be now and moving forward?
Wow, that's a question. Are you looking for a specific name or sort of more general, what
You
type
can
of
answer
person I
that
want to be?
however it feels, whatever comes up for you.
Well, I have to say that the enjoyment that I get in sharing these presentations with people and the feedback I get is so incredibly rewarding. And when I hear comments like yours, that it makes me feel like I'm adding to the discussion. I'm helping to not only show the greatness of some of this music, but also hopefully inspire people
Mm,
to be more risk takers and more creative. And I think that is what I'd like to be remembered for is helping to make people appreciate the creative process and become more attuned to the arts and what it takes to create art. And I think if I do that and I can give people a good time doing that, that's not a bad legacy.
awesome. Thank you again, Scott, so much. Where can people go to find everything about what you're up to?
Yes, deconstructingthemusic.com is the website. And I should also mention that fellow Beatleologist Ken Womack, a professor at Monmouth, who's written a lot of Beatles books, he and I started a monthly class during the pandemic. We're relaunching that class in October, and it's going to be a 5-year course,
Wow.
intense course in the Beatles. It is going to be amazing. We're going to have a great community of we always did, and we will continue that so people can be involved.
Huh.
And we're going to be playing lots of rare music, telling very interesting stories, getting into the background not only of the Beatles, but of the music of the time, stories on the Motown and the Beach Boys and Chuck Berry and all of that. So if you want to hear more about that and our upcoming trip to London, Liverpool, and Hamburg, fab4masterclass.com.
Wow, I'm so glad I asked. I want to hear more about all that. Great. And yeah, I just want to say to people listening, if your only option is virtual, definitely check out these lectures. There's I believe you have it's 9 DVDs for those
It's
antiquated enough like myself
11 films out there,
on
and they're all
yeah.
available for streaming.
Right. And they're available for streaming or DVDs. And
Right.
they're really exceptional. But if you get a chance to see Scott live, and I know he has his calendar on his website of gigs, in my opinion, there's no substitute for that experience because you're really like you're sharing it in a room full of fellow music fans. The sound system is likely to be way better than your TV at home. And I've been deeply moved and deeply inspired every time I've come to one of your lectures, Scott. So I
Thank you.
once
Thank
again
you.
just salute you on a job well done. Your passion and enthusiasm is contagious and shines through everything that I've seen you do. So thank you so much, and thanks again for your time today on the
Well, thank you
podcast.
so much for having me. This was a fun discussion. Going down memory lane here. It's a lot of fun.
Memory lane and penny lane.
Exactly.
Thanks, Scott.